Hello, friends. This is Dr. Benjamin Smith. Welcome back to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bulzacchelli, our lecturer in theology, and we're going to continue our discussion on the vices or the capital sins. We decided to focus on this topic because we're in the season of Lent, and during the season of Lent, it's of course a time for self-examination, asceticism, and purification. And a classical way, a traditional way of trying to achieve those goals is by reflection on the capital sins or the vices. So far in this series, we've talked about gluttony and greed and lust. We've also talked about envy and vanity. And hopefully today we're going to wrap up our discussion by focusing especially on wrath and on sloth. And then we'll also talk a little bit about pride as well. So pride is sometimes not in every list. We've talked a little bit in the past about there being different lists of the vices. Dr. Bulzacchelli, is there a particular one you'd like to start with today, wrath or sloth?
Well, I think I might prefer. I think wrath might be where I would want to start, and mainly because for a few reasons. Number one, I think wrath is a vice with which many people have experience. I think actually many people have experience with all three of these.
Sure.
But wrath is one of those things where you can kind of really. It's easier for people to see it in themselves, I think,
Sure.
than maybe some of the others.
Uh-huh.
And also, I think that pride and sloth there's a subtlety to them that, I think as we sort of move toward the end of the discussion, it would be more fruitful to reflect on those.
Sure. So when you're thinking about wrath, does this mean, Dr. Bulzacchelli, is it bad to be angry? Is anger intrinsically evil, Dr. Bulzacchelli?
I think the answer to that question is no.
What?
So
I've heard it said before that man's anger doesn't please God.
Yeah, man's anger, I suppose. Okay. That particular way of being angry that human beings have a propensity for, right?
Sure, especially in our fallen state, right?
Yeah. So Aristotle, right? There's that famous passage in the Nicomachean Ethics where Aristotle says, "To be angry is easy, but to be angry at the right person for the right reason, at the right time, with the right intensity, right, and for the right length of time is a difficult thing that few people master." And I think, I think that what he's getting at, right, is that there is a tendency for human beings just to react, and this is true actually with all the passions.
Sure.
But in mentioning anger specifically, I think that this shows even for Aristotle, a pagan, right? Which is very interesting, right? Because the pagans typically don't view anger in the way that Christians do, right? But even he sees that there is a certain irrational kind of anger that human beings are prone to, that doesn't have a correct object, that's out of all proportion, right? Or that that no longer serves a useful purpose. And should be abandoned, right? Because the issue is long behind us.
Sure.
So I think this is actually this is an interesting one of the capital sins, in my view, because in my observation, it seems that there are certain people who don't have a particularly big problem with this vice, right? I mean, there's some people who might even be criticized for not being angry when they should be. Too many things just roll off their backs. But then there are others, and we're all familiar with people like this who maybe you're one of them. I don't, it's easy to be one of those guys who just their leading emotion is anger when if things don't go your way, right? what's your response? Is it anger? And if so, is that always a rational response, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of what you'd want to ask, is what, what counts there as a rational kind of anger. Like, when is anger a rational response? One of the things that strikes me when you were talking about Aristotle and sort of pagan thoughts about anger, I think pagans, especially ancient, classical Greek literature, is very good in some ways on passions. In illustrating their extremes, and so one of the, in a way, one of the simplest and questions you can ask, but it's also one of the most profound questions you can ask in a classics class is about, what's the Iliad about? And, sing the rage of Achilles, right? That's, like right there, the first couple of lines, right? There's this like, oh, this poem is about the wrath of Achilles, right?
Yeah, he's gonna embroil civilization, the whole civilization, in this massive, fruitless war.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really interesting, when you think about that, right? Like they could see, right, like that wrath, anger, unchecked, right, can become a force of tremendous destruction. And that's true of all of the passions when they're sort of unchecked. When I think about the vice of anger, right, I think about it as this habitual disposition to allow the irascible passions, right? Those like really strong kind of, there's the kind of like, oh, I'm feeling good today kind of passion, right? And then there's those like gut ones, right? Like the irascibles, right?
Yeah.
And they really come out, and that's when you face opposition, right? When you face threat, right? And I think anger really comes up then, like that's when you really start to get, and what you're letting loose is that irascible, sort of passion yourself. I like that spirited part. Sometimes you can say like thumos, right? That's welling up in you, and you're trying to overcome an obstacle. So in one way, I kind of think of it as involving emotional aggression, right? Or passionate aggression, right? Which isn't necessarily bad, right? Like there are times when you actually kind of need that, kind of,
well, like, when you're actually being attacked.
Exactly.
When your children are actually being attacked.
Right. Yeah. And so what I would say is in the face of injustice, right? And then and that's, what St. Thomas thinks about anger is that anger is a response to it. I don't think this is actually comprehensive, but I think it's a good angle on it, that anger is a response to a perceived injustice, right? So we feel like we've been mistreated. I see this even in my kids, like when they play a game and they feel like somebody's cheated them, right? Like it's like something hasn't been fair, and then their anger rises up, right? So there's a perception of an injustice there. The question of its rationality then has to do with, was I really treated unjustly? And is my anger proportionate to the injustice done? Right. So, it's you look at someone sideways, and then, they want to assault you. Well, that's, that's disproportionate, right? And the person who has that, or say with your children or with, your friends, right? Maybe somebody, said something slightly off, and instead of just kind of either blowing it off or just kind of saying something calmly like, hey, I didn't appreciate that, right? You get this huge wrath, right? Where you actually kind of feel the heat coming out. Well, that's disproportionate, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so one of the, when you look at the way the fathers talked about anger, that really what they talk about habitual anger, right? And I think that what we're talking about is a person who, they're disposed to take offense,
right?
Disposed to sort of see the other as a threat, and feel the need always to kind of what would I say, defend their turf, right?
You can see that. Yeah. That's good. I like that. What I used to say in class is it's good to point that out because it's kind of like a pattern of disproportionate anger, right?
Hmm.
A pattern of destructive anger. You know, I used to tell my students that, if you get angry once or twice a day, it's unfortunate that you've run into too many jerks. But if you're getting mad all day long, it actually might be you that's the problem,
Right.
right? You might be too disposed, like you were saying, right? To
Hmm.
take offense, right? To
Hmm.
feel injustice. I actually think this is actually a bigger deal than we might think. We don't tend to think of ourselves as living, as we talked about before, in an honor society or a warrior society. But we do live in a society in which there's an enormous sense of entitlement, right?
Yeah.
And so people feel like they're entitled basically to live these lives of just luxury, comfort, and praise. And when they don't get that, right? When their desires are checked, when they're criticized, right? When
Hmm.
they're merely opposed, right? They have a reaction of extreme anger. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Uh,
I mean, it's
that's
weird.
right. Yeah. So, I've got, how can I put it? So I think that one of the main one of the main problems is that it's destructive to human community,
hmm hmm
right? And so, but and you could see how, of course, we talked before about how the different vices here, they do have a tendency to relate to each other and fold into each
Sure.
other. There's overlap because you could see what you're describing, right, could easily be seen as pride,
That's a
as
good
well,
point.
right?
Sure.
And so the person, a person who's very prideful and prone to anger,
hmm
is also going to be, um, my entitlements have to be. I need to be seen a certain way. I need to be regarded a certain,
Uh,
right. You need to
right.
respond to me a certain way, that fits my preconceived expectations of what I deserve. And if you don't, then I'm
Right.
enraged, right?
Right. Yeah. Having a lot of those is a good way to set yourself up to be angry. I've learned over the years, right? It's good to as we say in my family, often manage your expectations. But
Right. Uh,
okay, good. So there's a right kind of wrath or sort of anger, right, in given instances.
yeah.
But when we're thinking about wrath as a vice, as a capital sin, right?
Mhm.
We're thinking about it as a sort of pattern of destructive, excessive, disproportionate anger, right? From which you can say many evils flow, right? Like I like that sense. No,
Mhm.
I don't like, but I think I appreciate that sense of the capital sins as headwaters,
Uh-huh.
sources, right, from which right lots of sins flow, right? And you can see like if you seen this in a family perhaps
Mhm.
or maybe in your own life or in a particular relationship, maybe at work, right, where you have somebody who just has this habitual disposition towards wrath, towards anger, or towards this vicious habit that really does destroy just a lot, right? I mean, it can really shut down relationships. It can lead to a lot of sense of um, destruction of friendships, right?
Mhm.
Low self-esteem in the real sense, right? Like if you're really kind of beaten down by somebody who's really wrathful,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
I do. Now, so there's another, there are certain aspects of this sort of disposition, I think that, and I think they can manifest themselves in numerous ways, right? And
Mm-hmm.
maybe in some people they have certain dimensions that in other people maybe they don't.
Gotcha.
But one dimension of this particular vice that I think sometimes appears, right, is unforgiveness.
Mm,
Does that make
mm.
sense to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. You're just so angry, right? You're like, I'm not going to forgive, man. I gotta apply my wrath.
Yeah, you have to gratify it,
That's
right?
right. What about this, Rich? What about the person though who really? Because I think Nietzsche. I'm sorry to bring Nietzsche up again a second time here, but
No, you gotta do.
so, Nietzsche has the idea that the natural thing for wrath, right, or anger, is to inflict pain, right?
Uh,
That's how you satisfy that desire,
uh,
right? And I kind of think he's right a little bit, right? Um, the Even I think good anger it rises up in opposition and involves the application of force. I think, from like almost a emotional physiological perspective, right? If you're getting really, what's all that energy for, right? Well, that energy is to be forceful, right? Against some opposition or threat. He would say, well, what the natural thing to do is to inflict pain. Now, of course, as Christians, we're going to be really hesitant about endorsing that view or endorsing an unrestrained or unqualified, acceptance of that, right? We're going to say, okay, maybe, but it's going to be highly disciplined, right?
Yeah, and I think also the point is that it's not, I think in Christianity, it can't, I'm inclined to say that it can't be justified purely on the basis of satisfying my own
Sure.
entitlement. So again, the entitlement, right? I'm entitled to see you suffer. I'm not sure that I am entitled to see you suffer. I don't know if that's an entitlement that I have. And so this is a different question from whether you deserve to be punished, whether injustice, you have a debt to pay. That's a separate issue from whether I have an entitlement to see you suffer. You get what I'm...
Sure. I think certainly the good of it is not the satisfaction of my inflicting pain. Right. Where if there is a good to it, right, it's not going to be like, that felt good.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Like that's not the right disposition there. But what's really interesting, and the reason I brought this up, Rich, is to think about to tie it with unforgiveness, right? This is kind of like the root of self-destructive bitterness, right? That grows up where I'm angry, and what I really want to do is inflict some pain. And so I'm unwilling to give that up. So I don't forgive the person, but I can't actually inflict the pain, right? I mean, that's just poison, right? I mean, like to yourself. I mean, really more than certainly to others, but really to your own heart.
So like there's an economic analysis you might give to something like this, right? Apparently you value this so highly, right, that you're willing to pay a tremendous cost.
Sure.
A cost in terms of like your own moment to moment sense of peace. And also like your world of relationships, right? I mean, you will extract you'll extract your I mean, how can I put it? You'll gratify that anger no matter what it costs you in terms of relationships, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's only in that case. Well, I shouldn't say it's only it's especially self-destructive, right? And it leads to the harm of others. Well, so when we're thinking about wrath, right, we're kind of going out towards an opponent, right? In a sense. What do you think about sloth, right? Sloth is always a funny one because, I mean, you could, like you said, wrath seems kind of obviously vicious sometimes because, to be frank, it does get just downright vicious sometimes. Sloth, can kind of, it's almost has, like from an initial perspective, kind of looks like gluttony, right? Like, or like one could have the same reaction, like, well, maybe you shouldn't overeat, but like, is it really a sin? Sloth sounds like, okay, well, maybe you're a little lazy, but is that really sinful? Like, what's the truth about sloth? Why do the fathers of the church and so many spiritual writers emphasize it, and sometimes even emphasize it as one of the most spiritually destructive?
Well, I think it's funny because we in the ancient lists we see it manifest in different ways, right? There is this one called lupe, right, which is basically grief, affliction of mind. Okay? And then there's also Acadia, which is indifference, right?
Okay.
And
Indifference, I like that.
In what we think of as sloth, right? We're kind of taking both of those things and we're sort of shoving them into the same bag, and I think that so we usually call it Acadia, but we've turned that into this, we've broadened the definition, I think, to include this defeatism in the face of evil.
Yeah.
So the way I put it is like this, right? We can see these. We could see sometimes, in various sayings that we hear. Um, we can see some of these things manifest. Like, for example, if you can't beat them, join them.
Okay.
Right? Or you'll hear people say things like, well, you can't stop people from doing X,
Mm-hmm.
so we might as well make it safe, legal, and rare or something, right? So, I mean, what you've done is you've compromised with evil.
Mm-hmm.
You've given evil a place at the table, right?
Right.
Authority in the moral dialogue, because you've conceded ground. You've conceded that you
Mm-hmm.
can't. That good is not actually stronger than evil. That
Right. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
which basically means that you're denying the gospel.
Mm. Mm.
And this is really the definition of what John Paul II calls the culture of death.
Mm. That's interesting. Okay, so it's really the a kind of, and then in the way you're developing it, it's a kind of habit to acquiesce in the face of evil, to kind of surrender in the
Yeah,
face
like
of
when
evil.
push comes to, so it's one thing for me to say, like, I'm a Christian, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I believe in this, that, and the other thing, but then my beliefs, my moral my moral values, right, my principles, they're all good
Mm-hmm.
up to a point. But when my back
Mm-hmm.
is against the wall, hey, I've got to compromise, because you only got one life to live, right? I have to live
Mm-hmm.
to see another day. I have to,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Um, but when you look at the martyrs, what do you see? You see people who, when their backs are up against the wall,
uh,
they continue,
they continue.
right?
Right. Right. Yeah. 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 I can see that. Yeah. And so that's really sort of developing its sense of Acadia. Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So the martyrs would be examples of those who are not slothful, right? Because they don't just have this habit of acquiescence before difficulty, before a difficult evil.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and particularly when it comes to, when we talk about acquiescence, what we're really talking about is, you claim
Mm.
that there are certain things about reality here,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That God approves of certain things and disapproves of others, that he
Sure.
promises certain things and,
Right. Right.
right, and condemns certain things. Uh, and when things are difficult, all of that
Mm-hmm.
suddenly falls into the realm of ideals,
Mm-hmm.
abstract ideals,
Right.
to which
Right.
you might
Right.
aspire in the best of times.
Uh-huh.
But
Uh-huh.
but under these conditions,
Mm-hmm.
we just, we can't be absolutists about these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So in that sense, then, maybe I guess cowardice would be one of
Yeah, cowardice
the
is
fruits
part of
of.
this, is
Yeah,
symptomatic.
okay, gotcha. Yeah, so it's interesting. The you could also kind of see fortitude as an
Uh,
opposite, right?
yeah.
There, when St. Thomas talks about it, it's interesting. He does talk about it as an evil, or as involving a reaction to evil,
Hmm.
or pain. But the way he put it, that I found really interesting, um, is that it involves sorrow
Yeah.
over the difficulty of a spiritual good.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah.
Which I want to unpack that just a little bit, because I think it's
Uh-huh.
interesting, right? It's instead of sort of the reaction, so the object here is a spiritual good, but there's some sort of difficulty, right, attached to it. And so
Yes.
what should be the response, right, is say like fasting, right, or something like that,
Hmm.
right, is that you sort of have fortitude, and you rise up and you sort of try to overcome, by the grace of God, right, that
Yeah.
difficulty
Uh-huh.
because of the spiritual good at hand, right? But instead of focusing on the spiritual good, which could inspire you to overcome the difficulty, right,
Yeah.
you just sort of languor and sorrow and grief, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
No, I think it's right on the money. And I think
Yeah,
I don't think it's, well, it's a different emphasis than the one I'm placing, but
sure,
it's
sure.
part of the same issue, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if you think of, well, okay, so I remember a conversation I had with a Benedictine monk when I was an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of those. And I remember, he was saying, in some ways, it's easy to be a martyr, right?
Hmm.
By which he meant a bloody martyr, right? It's
Okay.
one thing to, in one glorious moment, right, to
Hmm.
give
Hmm.
myself up completely
Hmm.
in the face of a threat.
Right, right, right.
Um, but it's another thing, right, to live this thing that they call white martyrdom,
Hmm.
which is really, the life that all Christians are, in a certain sense, expected to live, particularly in times of when Christianity is in disfavor, right? So,
Hmm.
for example, in our society, or
Hmm.
worse, right, in a society where Christianity is under active oppression,
Hmm.
maybe somebody's
Hmm.
not killing you,
Hmm.
but
Sure.
they make being Christian a very difficult choice to make day in and day out.
Right, right, right.
And so the person who is slothful here, and this is interesting because this is under that other word, right? That
Hmm.
Greek word lupe,
Okay.
right? Which is that grief or affliction. Okay,
Hmm.
so you're living your life, and what you see, right,
Hmm.
when you think about the Christian walk in front of you,
Hmm. Hmm.
is the you just dread, like it,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it's the difficulty of it. That's
That's
what you
right.
see,
Yes.
rather than the
Yes. Yes.
joy
Right. Right.
of the fact that you're basically living in a different world than these people
Hmm.
around you are living in. You
Hmm.
see things in reality that they don't perceive because you
Hmm.
have the benefit of the gospel.
Right.
Um,
Sure. Sure.
so rather than sort of living in that joy, right, you
Hmm.
live under, oh, I would that it were different for me,
Right.
right? And
Right.
because of that, you're likely to sort of lose heart
Hmm.
and compromise.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that's the key here, especially for somebody because but, as you pointed out on several occasions during our conversations, there's always individual acts, right? And so there's always, that we want to distinguish from habits. There's
Uh,
always going to be those moments where we recognize, like, oh man, I really don't want to go to confession today. I really don't want to go to mass. I don't, whatever it is, right?
uh,
Or something more challenging. But that's different from this habit, right, of dwelling on, right, the pain or the difficulty of it, right? There's a
yeah,
kind of almost, I want, I, I'm tempted to say it's like softness that you could associate with it, maybe as well as a kind of sense of self pity, like, oh, why do I have to do this again? Like, or why do like, why do I have to suffer? Why
uh,
is it difficult? Like, I know as a child, and I think a lot of children work through this. I remember, my parents emphasizing the importance of overcoming self pity, right?
mhm.
Like it's very easy for us to just start feeling sorry for ourselves, right? That's not exactly the same as sloth, but it seems like it's kind of allied. Um, but one of the things about it, I think, like you said, is or indicated, is it really can sap us, right? It can
Yeah,
really undermine us, and I think that's the thing that really. It's kind of like in an odd sort of way. I remember C.S. Lewis saying this, and I think St. Thomas picks it up, or St. Thomas would have said it much earlier, but I think St. Thomas picks up a similar note when he talks about the idea that like he, with all the virtues, he brings this up, like, is justice the greatest of the virtues, right? Is fortitude the
um,
greatest of the virtues? And St. Thomas almost always finds a way to say, yes, secundum quid, right? In a
right,
certain
right,
respect, right? And so there's a way in which fortitude, right? If you don't have fortitude, you're not going to make it.
yeah, right,
Does that make
right,
sense? Like,
yeah,
certainly we would put wisdom and justice in a sense higher than fortitude from different angles, right?
uh,
But there's another sense in which if you don't have fortitude, you're dead meat,
well, in a very real sense, fortitude is the first virtue that you need to develop, like when
Mm-hmm,
you're five,
mm-hmm,
because if you don't, you're going to
mm-hmm.
fail every single time,
Right, because there's
right?
always
You're
difficulty
going to
involved.
be a failure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that sloth, in a way, right, is somewhat similar in its importance. Right. Every spiritual good that's worth having, past certain extraordinary events or a certain age, um,
And
in,
in the
in
fallen world, there's always difficulty.
yeah, is going to have difficulty associated with it. So if you're slothful, right, if you have an aversion to the difficulty that can be attached to the spiritual good, and that's
Uh-huh.
habitual. It is deadly in the sense that eventually it will turn you from every spiritual good.
Right. Right.
And that way it's devastating, right? I mean, it's like corruption in the root,
Yeah.
almost. Yeah.
It's interesting because when I talk about the capital sins, for the most part, my inclination is to talk about sloth last for
Mm-hmm.
this reason. Uh, and and actually, I usually teach it right because I do it this way because I think that sloth is one of the most insidious
Mm-hmm.
of the capital sins in
Mm-hmm.
our society today.
Mm-hmm.
For
Mm-hmm.
some reason, right, our society is structured in terms of its expectations or demands, I'm not really sure what,
Yeah.
in such a way that if you have the slightest inclination towards slothfulness, it's going to turn you off.
That's right. I think Rich, we're spoiled.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, I think we're just soft and spoiled compared to our Christian ancestors.
Uh-huh.
I mean, we just have it, I mean, right now we're going through this, health crisis, right? This, COVID-19, and we don't need to get off into that too much, but, like there are some people who are really suffering from it, but the vast majority of us are just kind of staying home and hunkering down and
Uh-huh.
watching lots of Netflix and eating too much. And, I mean, like that's, that's not real suffering, right?
Yeah, right, right.
Now there are, of course, people, and I want to be very clear about this, who are enduring real suffering from this situation, but the vast majority of us are not, or the majority of us are not. But that's just one small example, I think, of we're just so used to getting what we perceive to be desirable without great difficulty, that yeah, that I think we have a propensity, an extra propensity for sloth.
Uh-huh.
Although I want to introduce a counterpoint and see what you say about this, Rich. So some people will endure great difficulties to have six-pack abs,
Yeah.
but do nothing to go to church.
That so yeah, this is an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest, because
Mm-hmm.
on the one hand, I'm inclined to say, right, that sloth particularly has to do with spiritual goods. So
Yeah. Right.
I'm not sure, right, that
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
say I'm not sure the fact that he's working out to get six pack abs
But won't go to church.
indicates that he's not slothful or something,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Okay, I
Right.
think he may very well be slothful, like profoundly
Mm-hmm.
slothful,
Mm-hmm.
because look, the spiritual good is something that he can't measure in any earthly terms,
Right.
that he can't see the
Mm-hmm.
payoff
Mm-hmm.
in this life.
Mm-hmm.
It really depends upon faith and hope, right?
Sure. Yeah.
He has to be
Yep.
able to look beyond the horizon of this life and see that there's real value in this spiritual thing,
Mm-hmm.
this spiritual good, even though in this life you can't lay your fingers on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't
Mm-hmm.
like you,
Yeah.
I could see the six. Well, I can't. I don't have six pack abs, but if I did, I'd be able to see them in the mirror,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
You could see that payoff,
Sure. Sure.
but how exactly does one see, the payoff of his fasting, his abstinence,
Mm-hmm.
his
Mm-hmm.
self-denial?
Mm-hmm.
I guess there are psychological ways to measure it, but it's difficult to
Sure.
get it's difficult to get that guy to appreciate that.
Yeah.
In fact,
So,
Friedrich Nietzsche would
uh,
would hold you in disdain, right,
sure.
for thinking that you achieved anything there.
Yeah. I think it's interesting here is the an associated problem might actually be the case that the person who's obsessed with physical appearance
Uh,
is a good sign that they are slothful.
uh-huh.
Maybe it's not a guarantee, right? But it's a good indication. I've read a couple spiritual writers who have the view that frenetic activity in our current society is actually a sign of its profound slothfulness, right? Whereas, our Christian ancestors could talk about the joy of fellowship with Christ in prayer, right? And they could just rest in God and rest in fellowship with Christ and the Holy Spirit. That's not something you hear very much contemporary Christian talk, right? Where you think, the less you're at rest in those spiritual goods, right? Kind of the more you have to do to compensate on the physical goods, on the temporal goods, but all of those are finite, passing away. They run out of your hands as soon as you try to hold on to them, that sort of thing. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that opens a can of worms we don't have time to even address today. In another podcast, maybe I'd love to talk about it. But for me, this is a massive issue, and that is the obsession with activity.
Yes.
In the religious world, right? So, I mean, the triumph of mendicantism, and I'm not bashing the mendicants. I'm just saying, like, that model as opposed to the contemplative model, right? If you want to, and I think it's a false dichotomy, but what we've done is we've introduced a false dichotomy here. We've split this sort of doing aspect from the contemplative, and now we've sort of turned the contemplative dimension into what would we say, right? It's we turn it into abstraction. We turn it into rigidity.
Yeah.
I mean, we turn it into like some sort of misplaced piety or something.
Sure.
But
the funny thing is, from a traditional perspective, right? You'd have to almost say that the person who is still in contemplation of Christ, right, is the least slothful, whereas the person who is hyperactive in the activities of this world are actually the most slothful. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think so. It's paradoxical from our point of view, but I see the point, and I think that but look at some of the writings you see today. Look at some of the things people say, right? Even well-intentioned Christians, will always, they can't leave it at contemplation. It always has to become action.
Right.
Right. So. Well, anyway, I mean, we could talk about that forever.
Sure. Yeah, but it's one of the things I think is really fascinating about all the vices that we've talked about is they open up such a perspective, right, and avenue for discussion and analysis. And some of the ones that you wouldn't think, right? I mean, you kind of think, okay, well, drunkenness and lust, right? Those are the big vices. Really, they are, but they're kind of like simplistic and boring in some ways. They could be more complicated, obviously, but some of the ones that are actually deeper and more, how to put this, more malicious, more spiritually damaging, more socially corrupting, are some of the ones we wouldn't sort of see on the surface. I'm not trying to play down the importance of those kind of physical kind of things like lust and drunkenness or gluttony or whatever. But there's actually these ones that are spiritually oriented, actually, that have a greater gravitas to them, I think.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in the difference, I think, in some authors between things like pride and lust, right? Or the prideful person versus the gluttonous person. Just to kind of wrap up here with pride, which I think can be associated with sloth, but it's pride in a way is as spiritual as sloth, but it has a somewhat different emphasis, right? And so pride's not always distinguished as a separate vice, right? And in St. Thomas's work, it's usually not counted directly as a vice, but as the root of all the vices, right? Or something like that, right? I think what he's trying to do there is kind of contrast pride and charity. So you have kind of charity as the form of all the virtues, pride is sort of the form of all the vices, kind of thing. And one of the things I think that's important to St. Thomas about pride is it allows him to talk about diabolical malice and demonic evil, right? Because there's no physicality in St. Thomas's theology for demonic evil, right? it's merely pride, right? Which is really interesting, right? In Thomas's view, the angels don't have passions, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So for him, there's this kind of course, he doesn't believe there is such a thing as pure evil, but there's a pride is their sin, right? And that's how we become kind of like them,
It
right?
is in
When
a
are
sense,
sinful.
yeah. So let me put it like this: pride, in a sense, is what sin is,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? So if you think about like the choice between my my will and God's will,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Who's the
Yeah.
one with the ultimate authority
Mm-hmm,
here?
mm-hmm.
Who has to conform to whom?
Right. Right.
Uh, and and I find, right, that in pride, this is always the struggle in the fallen world, and this is why everyone has an issue with pride. You might not have an
Mm-hmm.
issue with
Right.
anger or with lust or whatever, but you
Right.
you have an issue with pride.
Yes.
Uh,
If you're, yeah, yeah.
everybody does, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So ask yourself certain questions. Um, how difficult is it for me to surrender my particular good to the common good,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
If the answer is really, really hard and I'm inclined not to do it, then I would say we
Right.
have issues with pride, right?
Right. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Uh, if I ever find myself doing this, right?
mm-hmm.
If I think to myself, okay, I know this is the definitive teaching of the church on this
Right.
moral matter,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
Um, or like this is clearly witnessed in the Bible
Mm-hmm,
as, the moral standard. I
mm-hmm.
know that, and I'm not questioning whether it is or is not
Right.
said.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
saying I don't think it should be that way. Dude, it doesn't matter what you think,
Right.
right? What should be the
Right.
case or what shouldn't be the case,
Mm-hmm,
right? You're not the guy who gets to make that decision.
mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm.
but this is what people do.
Sure.
And this is a big thing in our society, actually, right? When we
Mm-hmm,
see one of the real places we see pride manifest
mm-hmm,
is in what people think should be the case
mm-hmm.
about reality, about
Uh,
moral, and these days even like physical reality. Like
mm-hmm,
for example, and this is totally politically incorrect,
mm-hmm,
right? We'll get banned from YouTube, but like it, the whole thing with gender theory, right? I
mm-hmm,
mean, if
mm-hmm,
you have a man's body and you say, but I know I'm a woman,
mm-hmm,
I'm going to say, right, that what you're doing is you're attempting to make reality conform to you rather than
mm-hmm,
assent
mm-hmm,
to the way things really are.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and that's a manifestation of pride. And
mm-hmm.
now, here's the thing: I, I can talk to somebody like that and say that, and at the same time say, and you're not alone in the
Right.
tendency to engage the world that way,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
This is a problem with being fallen.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, those sorts of things you're pointing out are especially clear manifestations of pride,
Uh-huh.
right? Especially when you're trying to say that I should be the standard of truth, I
Mm-hmm.
should be the standard of physical reality. What St. Thomas kind of puts in, right, is the idea that pride involves making yourself the ultimate end, not
Yeah.
just an end, but the ultimate end,
Right.
which, right, only belongs to God. And so really you're kind of putting yourself in that place through pride, right? You're saying, I'm the ultimate end of this person. I'm the ultimate end of this part of reality. I'm the ultimate
Yeah.
end of whatever. In which case, your will, your substance, your person, your heart, right, um, is in the place really where God should be, right? Where God
That's
should
right.
be right at the ultimate end. We end up placing ourselves there, and that's why we can say, you know what? I know that Catholic Christianity teaches X, but we don't ever say this out loud, but hey, I don't want it to, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm
Right.
going to bend it to because Catholicism needs to serve me,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Right.
Um, the not that I need to follow Catholicism in order to serve God, right? And so I think that that bending everything back to oneself, right? I think it's, we don't do this very often, but quote Martin Luther here. So the curvatus se, right? That there's that we have this curve back onto the self, right? Is a nice way, I think, of expressing pride, right? Of what pride is, right? It turns everything back towards me and my will.
That's right. So, so basically, that video that we've seen on YouTube, it was Ordain a Lady, right? You remember that one?
Yes.
So I would say that is like clear. I mean, it's gushing with pride, right?
Mm-hmm.
The person deciding that while St. Paul, like she literally says, don't listen to St. Paul, right? Yeah. And she declares that God called her, even though the church says no. And I wonder, like, what evidence do you have that you've been called, right? Like, what is your evidence? And here it's purely, it seems, the subjective sense that I think I want to be, or something. But the objective condition, right, is that orders are a sacrament in the church and under the custody of the church, given by Christ under his authority, and under certain conditions. And in fact, you have not been called, right? So if you ask a priest, how do you know that you're called to the priesthood? He'll tell you, well, because I knelt before the bishop and he put his hands on me and said, receive the Holy Spirit.
Right. You're literally called.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's very important, Rich. I would want to say one other thing that's useful. We're kind of running long on time here, so we'll wrap up here. But if you go through any of the vices that we've talked about, envy, vanity, wrath, even lust, gluttony, you can find, I think, oddly enough, pride around that, even with things like adultery, right? Like, I know that this woman is somebody else's wife, but she needs to serve my desires and satisfaction, right? Does that make sense? So that what you end up with there is at the root of adultery, right? Or I know that this woman's not my wife, but whatever. At the root of it is pride, right? I can treat my wife unjustly because really she exists for the sake of me, right? Or anything like that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Rich. Do you have any final thoughts here to kind of leave us with as we wrap this up and move on to other topics in the future?
Well, only that in this time of Lent, right, I think it's really important for us to reflect on these vices, not just on vices, but in the sense that Lent is about the purgative way, right? That we should take the time to reflect on these things and take stock of who we are and where we are in our spiritual journey, right? The point of all this is not so you can diagnose the spiritual condition of your spouse or your parents or whatever, but so that we can look in the mirror and take stock of ourselves.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very important. That self-examination, right, is the vices are teaching about the vices, the proper understanding of those capital sins is really invaluable, irreplaceable, I should say, resource for a self-examination. Well, friends, I hope that you have benefited from our conversation here and that you've been edified. We will be continuing on next week with a new set of topics. Still thinking about what that's going to be. We've got a couple things in mind. But until next time, God bless and stay safe.